Okay, good morning everyone. Hope you're all well and not climbing the walls and pulling each other's hair up if you have siblings. Today we will be looking at the topic B3.3, which is the topic chemistry of food. This looks at carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, and I have split it into 3 lessons, so you'll be getting it in 3 installments. 2 of them will be today, and then 1 of them will be tomorrow. So today's lessons will be carbohydrates and lipids, and tomorrow's lesson will be proteins and the food tests, which you will probably remember from doing before. So today's date is the 2nd of February, which also happens to be my birthday, and let's just go through the learning objectives. So the bronze one is to define the term macromolecule and give some examples of macromolecules. The silver one is to explain the properties and uses of the 3 main macromolecules, and the gold one is to compare and contrast the 3 macromolecules used by the body and explain why they are so essential and why they're an essential part of a balanced diet. So the key words for today's lesson we will go through in a moment. They are simple sugar, monosaccharide, disaccharide, polysaccharide, macromolecule, monomer, and polymer. So for the key words then, we have simple sugar, which is a sugar composed of 1 or 2 units. For example, glucose is made up of a single unit. Monosaccharide is a simple sugar made up of 1 unit, and glucose is an example of a disaccharide is a simple sugar made up of 2 units, which are joined together with a chemical bond. And an example of this is sucrose. A polysaccharide is a complex sugar composed of more than 2 units. So you must have more than 2 units of a sugar to have a polysaccharide, whilst a monosaccharide is a simple sugar made of 1 unit. So you've got 1 unit, 2 units, and more than 2. So an example of a polysaccharide is starch. Macromolecule is a large organic molecule, such as a carbohydrate, lipid, or a protein, and a monomer is a molecule which is the building block for a larger molecule. Building block is a very key word of this definition as well. And a polymer, for the last definition, is a molecule formed of monomers joined together through a chemical reaction. So I've sort of highlighted bits that are the key points of these definitions as I go through it. This will obviously be available for you to watch again and again if you want to. So you can come back to it later, and it's also going to be on OneNote if you want to see these keywords again and maybe write them down as well, because they will be very helpful later on. Some exams like to test you on these 3 here and these 2 at the bottom. Okay, so carbohydrates. A carbohydrate is a compound which makes up the structure of a cell. So it is essential in the makeup of a balanced diet, and it also provides the main source of energy for the body. Proteins and lipids also provide energy for the body, but they're not as easy to break down as a carbohydrate. So our bodies tend to use carbohydrates first, and then they go on to lipids and proteins. So some examples of carbohydrates include sugar up here, bread, rice, potatoes, these are lentils in here, milk, honey, and fruit juices. Okay, so let's go back to the very basic. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen only. So there are no other molecules, no other elements that make up a carbohydrate. It's only these. So carbohydrates can either be hexagonal or pentagonal in shape. So as you can see here, we've got a hexagonal one, and that is glucose, and then we've got a pentagonal one, and we'll come to that one a little bit later when we get into how bonds are formed and with which one. So types of carbohydrate. We have simple sugars and starches, and we also have non-starch polysaccharides, which are NSPs. We're going to mainly focus on this one and this one today. So simple sugars and starches. So let's go into simple sugars then. So if you remember for the definitions of that we went through at the beginning of the lesson, a simple sugar is a sugar composed of 1 or 2 units. A simple sugar is soluble in water and are known as monosaccharides or disaccharides. And if you remember, a monosaccharide is a simple sugar made up of 1 unit, and glucose is an example of that. So throughout this lesson, we're going to use this simple diagram for glucose to show where it bonds and with which one. It's easier to see with different colours, I find. Or that's how best I learned anyway when I did this at school. So a disaccharide is a simple sugar made up of 2 units which are joined together, like sucrose, which is here. So you can see that you have glucose here, which is the same as that one. It's really hard to draw on a trackpad. And then we have this other molecule here. So if we look at glucose more closely, you have glucose here, which, as I said earlier, is a hexagonal shape. It's one of the only sugars that is a monosaccharide, as it exists on its own as an individual unit composed of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. But remember, it's only those elements. You can't have any more elements in glucose, otherwise it's not glucose anymore. So this is the structure of a glucose molecule, and I want to see if from this structure you can guess the chemical formula for glucose. I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about it. Okay, so did you get C6H12O6? Because if you look here, you've got one C there, one C there, a C there, there, and there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, and then you've got your oxygen there, 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 and there. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm missing an oxygen. Oh, there it is, 6. So there's 6 oxygens, and then you count your hydrogens. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there you go, you've got 12 hydrogens. Okay, so if we move on to the other monosaccharides that I mentioned earlier, you also have fructose and galactose. So these also have the same chemical formula as glucose. It is just the arrangement of the chemicals, of the elements in the structure of the chemical. So as you can see here, this one is a pentagonal. So I'm just going to write pent because I really can't spell, I can't write that much on a trackpad. And then this one is also hexagonal. But if you look here, this is the difference between glucose and galactose. So glucose has the H on top and the OH down here. So, oh, that's a really bad O. So There you go, that's what glucose is. So if you can see here, galactose has the H on the bottom and OH on the top. So that is the only thing that determines whether it's galactose or glucose, is the orientation of these two parts here. But you won't need to remember that much now, because it is a little bit of AS content, so don't worry too much about it. You just need to be aware that glucose is not the only monosaccharide that there is. You will need to know a little bit about disaccharides, which we'll go on to next. So these are, again, we're going to come back to glucose with the orange hexagon. So these are the other two that are monosaccharides. So we've got fructose, which is a green pentagon, and galactose, which is a purple hexagon. So if you combine glucose and fructose together, you get sucrose, which is a disaccharide, and it is bonded together with a glycosidic bond. You won't need to know the name of that bond now, but it is good to know that there is a chemical bond between the two, and when the bond is formed, it releases a water molecule, and that is called a condensation reaction. So water is released and the bond is formed. But again, you don't need to know that yet. It's just good to be aware of it. So you have sucrose, but what if you combined glucose and galactose? Well, that makes lactose, and you probably recognise this because it is found in milk. So that is the sugar that is found in milk, and it is also the sugar that some people are intolerant to. So they cannot handle it very well in the digestive tract, and so it can cause some issues there. What happens though if you combine glucose and glucose? Well, that makes maltose, and if you took, we're going to get onto this a little bit in a minute, but if you took maltose and you just kept combining it, you would make starch, because starch is completely made out of glucose. So there you go, that makes starch. Monosaccharides can only form bonds with other, the monosaccharides can form bonds with another to form the disaccharides, so as I went through there, and glucose is always involved. So you can see the common theme here is that glucose is always one of the molecules, at least one of the molecules. Obviously in maltose it is both of the molecules. So you can't have a fructose and a galactose combining. It's always got to be a glucose and then a fructose, or a glucose and galactose, or a glucose and glucose. So if we move on to starch then, as I just mentioned, starch is a polysaccharide, which if you remember back to the definitions, it means it's a complex sugar composed of more than 2 units joined together by chemical bonds. And those chemical bonds will be the same as those simple sugars, and wherein they're formed during condensation reactions and they release water when doing so. So starch is only made out of glucose, unlike some of the disaccharides we just looked at. So that is why, so if you looked at 2 of these, that would be maltose. So essentially it's lots of maltose disaccharides joined together to make starch. Starch are only made out of glucose, and they are found in plants as the main energy store. So they are not found in humans. We do not make starch. We make a substance called glycogen. That is our storage molecule for carbohydrates and for energy. But this is the plant version of an energy storage unit. They are also they've also got very long chains, and so they can store more. And there are 2 forms of starch as well. There's amylase. It's going to be really hard to write this very long word in a minute. So you've got amylase and amylopectin. which is going to be very hard to write. Bear with me. So you can't get any more molecules, any more varieties of starch. It's just these ones. So there you go, amylase and amylopectin. So we won't go into what makes these different. You just need to know that there's these two different forms of starch. So because starch is found in plants, it is not water soluble, and it is also very hard to break down. We cannot break it down in our gut ourselves. It has to be broken down during a cooking process so that it can be digested. We also have enzymes, which are a type of protein, which help with this as well, but it needs to be cooked before we can eat it. Otherwise, it just passes straight through. So let's look a little bit, very briefly, at non-starch polysaccharides, which are NSPs. These include fibre molecules. So fibre molecules are mainly insoluble, but they can't be broken down by digestion. So that is why it is recommended in our diets that we eat a lot of fibre, because it helps everything pass through naturally. So they pass through the body chemically unchanged, and a main example of a non-starch polysaccharide is cellulose. And cellulose is the substance that provides plants with the rigid support and structure needed for them to stay upright or stand up. So we've got some functions of carbohydrates as well to go through. So the first one is energy supplies to the body. So a carbohydrate is the main energy supply that we use for our cells to survive and function. So we break down glucose to release ATP energy, and then we can use that for anything really, respiration, movement, anything that a certain cell does. We're going to go a little bit into specialised cells later on, so we'll go into that later, but it's just important to know that it supplies energy to the body, and it is the main form of energy that we use. As I said earlier, lipids and proteins provide energy, but we don't use them as much as carbohydrates. So starch is digested and stored as glycogen. So I mentioned this earlier, I mentioned glycogen earlier. Glycogen is the storage molecule that we use in our bodies to store energy for future use. So energy that we don't need right now, we will store normally in our liver, and it will be released later on when we do need it. So say you've just eaten a big meal and you've got lots of energy and you don't need all of it to function, your liver will store some of it away, and then when you're as you're going throughout your day, in between meals, it will release some of that energy so that you have the energy to carry out your tasks and you don't have to keep eating like some grazing animals, for example. So carbohydrates require less energy to break down than other macromolecules like fats, as I previously mentioned, and sugars and starches are the most efficient form of energy. So what happens if carbohydrates are consumed to an excess? So this means that they are consumed more, you consume more than you need to survive. So normally you would store too much energy and you would gain weight. So your body mass index would go up. This is this scale here, and that is your BMI. You've probably heard of that before. It is your measurement of your weight and your height, and it is compared that way. So that's why I put this cartoon here saying your weight would be perfect if you were 7 feet tall, because that would be his BMI that they were relating to there. So unused energy is stored as fat, and that leads to an increased body weight. And also, excessive sugar consumption can lead to dental problems such as decay. So eating lots of fruit sugars can cause more damage than good sometimes. So what happens if you don't have enough carbohydrate in your diet? Well, you've got this condition called Merasmus, and that is normally prevalent in very underdeveloped countries, and it can lead to hair loss, severe loss of muscle and body mass, and it makes people appear like an old person. So they've got a drawn-in face, a sunken face, and very frail looking, and that's regardless of the person's age. Okay, so the last thing I want you to do is to complete this quiz, which is an interactive activity on Kerboodle. I will put the link, which is here, in the description box of this video so you can access it from there, because obviously you can't click the link on this video as it's a video and I'm not very technology advanced, and I can't put an iCard up there or anything, so I'll put it in the description box for you to look at. If you have any emails about this topic and anything that you don't understand, please email me. This is my email here. Please note that my name is spelled wrong here because they put my login details in wrong. So my name is actually Macleod, not OED, but we'll deal with that for the moment. At the end of these 3 lessons, there will be a short test, which I've already made, and that will be based off all 3 lessons on macromolecules. And also all of the lessons are on OneNote, and again, I will link that in the description box down below. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you in today's lesson later on for lipids.